In 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women resulted in the groundbreaking Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action,
an agenda for change which set the tone for the next quarter century of feminist movement building across the globe.
In honor of this momentous gathering and the women and girls who made it possible,
Breakthrough is inviting activist leaders to reflect on what happened and where we go from here.
How have the lives of women and girls changed for the better or for worse?
And how do we keep up momentum in the fight for gender equality?
Hi, my name is Priya Kvam. I am the Director of Strategy and Advocacy at Breakthrough, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with my mother, Aruna Rao. She is a trailblazing feminist activist, the co-founder and former executive director of Gender at Work, and the host of the Gender at Work podcast. Check it out. Aruna, Ma, how are you?
To be with you here, Priya. I'm so delighted to be with my wonderful, brilliant, trailblazing daughter.
Oh, I like the word trailblazing for me too. I can don it. So today we're talking about Beijing, the Beijing Conference, which happened in 1995, and the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which came out of it, and also where feminist movements have gone since and what we're hoping for from the future of activism in this space. So kind of take us back. When the Beijing Platform for Action was launched, what was it about that platform that made it significant from your perspective?
First of all, it was a very hopeful time. It was a time of solidarity. It was a time when we all believed that we could come together. There was a whole process before Beijing, where national and regional meetings happened. And so everybody came prepared to Beijing with ideas and with a lot of hope. And the Beijing Platform of Action was really revolutionary for its time. It was anchored in human rights. 189 countries signed up to these commitments that ranged from, the areas you would expect, like education, health, poverty, sustainable development, but also touched on things like the environment and, talked about the global climate crisis, talked about girls in STEM, talked about, the pandemic of violence against women. So it was really quite, it was really forward looking. I know that's a word that's used a lot about Beijing, but it was. And I think the fact that all of these countries came together, and we were about 30,000 activists there in Huairu, which was the sort of the NGO conference, part of Beijing. There were 17,000 official delegations, official participants, but we were 30,000, and sometimes there were makeshift arrangements. We were holding workshops in tents. They were, not completed concrete sort of shells of buildings. People were overflowing, out of the venues where people like Hillary Clinton spoke. You remember, she spoke in Beijing and talked about women's rights as being human rights. Lots of us kind of sitting outside on the steps, hoping to hear a little bit of what was going on in these official venues. So, I think it was a time of a lot of hope. And at that time, I was working with BRAC in Bangladesh. And so I had all my colleagues, from BRAC together with me. And we did several sessions at Beijing. So I think that kind of, was the spirit of Beijing. But I wanted to ask you, knowing that was the spirit, and that was now 26 years ago, and I know you've been involved in generation equality. So what was your experience, and what's the spirit been like, and what are your hopes for where this is going to go forward?
It's been a really strange process because we've been amidst the pandemic. We never anticipated that the CSW, that would be the kickoff of Generation Equality, and then the Mexico City Forum, and now coming up in June, the Paris Forum, these major milestones on the road to really finalizing this blueprint for action for feminist movement builders around the world would happen virtually across time zones over Zoom calls. It's been energizing and strange, just another layer of the surreal experience that we've had over the last year amid the coronavirus. And it's been an incredible honor to be there, to have a seat at the table, to be in dialogue with DFID from the UK, with the European Women's Lobby, with organizations from India and Central America, and the Women's Ministry of Kenya. And I know that there were so many women's NGOs that were clamoring to have a seat at the table. So for Breakthrough to be one of the co-leads, and we are co-leading the Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence, is really an honor. And I feel like I'm learning so much. I just go into these meetings as a sponge, and I'm just kind of slurping up all this wisdom from feminists of generations before. But it also has all the quirks of a typical UN-led process. In this morning's meeting, we talked about the word endorse for several minutes and whether we could really stand behind the word endorse to describe what our action was going to be in relation to other organizations that were making commitments. Actually, is it approve? Is it welcome? We're talking about the nitty-gritty of language because it matters so much when it comes to policy and human rights. But it sometimes feels like we're setting ourselves on a course that's very, very ambitious, that has many, many voices, and we're not all swimming in the same direction. And we have different expectations of what works and what doesn't. So there was a comment in a previous meeting about how ineffectual change strategies that rely on mass media campaigns and public awareness campaigns are. And here I am as a representative of Breakthrough thinking, I don't know if you fully appreciate the value add of every member of this coalition because, they were saying, no, there's no data to support it. And so it can sometimes be a challenge to ensure that it is an inclusive space. And there are certainly activists who, work with disabled feminists, who work with Indigenous feminists, people for whom English is not a native language, who are really beating that drum of inclusivity. And then we also talk about how not to be gender essentialist. So I think some of the same conundrums that people faced in the run-up to Beijing and even in the dialogues at Beijing, we're facing today. We're still, strained by resources. We are still trying to figure out how to finance these bold, ambitious commitments. We're setting ourselves up for a set of targets that we're hoping to reach by 2026, fingers crossed, but that's only 5 short years away. And so I think there is some of the hope. There's also a lot of fatigue just because of what we're living through in our lives outside of this process. And then there's an expectation that it has to do more. There has to be accountability. There has to be funding. There has to be a really solid commitment from the private sector and from governments. And if we don't do that, then what? Where do we go from there?
That, of course, those are all really important issues. And what we're facing now, and that your generation is taking into the future, really is these multiple crises that have hit us now. There's a climate crisis, which is looming over our heads. It's, we're racing towards climate extinction, as you know, and that's really forcing a lot of us to kind of rethink. Can we do, the same old? Can we, keep sort of discussing, the words? Can we keep arguing in the same way we've argued? We don't have the time. The World Economic Forum says it's going to take 99 more years before we achieve gender equality. Well, we don't have 99 more years, so there's that, but there's also, I think, there's a sense of kind of hopelessness, because because inequality has grown so much that, we would not think that we would at this moment be at that kind of a place. We would have hoped for something better. We've seen all around us the rise of sort of ultra nationalist governments which, back at the time of Beijing were supportive of these issues. Now it's not just the Holy See and these other, extremely right-wing governments that oppose women's rights. And, we could argue about whether that's because we've achieved so much, we've been so successful that, we've caused, that has caused a backlash. But you have countries around the world where you see such a visceral backlash, against women's rights and gender equality and the whole spectrum, against LGBTQ rights and the value of everybody as a human being. And, it seems like we've really, that whatever that was sitting under that rock has really come out, and it's like, oh my God, you're threatening the very existence of who I am. The patriarchal family, the patriarchal powers, and the institutions that have been built. So I think it's a very tough time now because of all of these, the coming together of all of these crises at a time when we know we've got to really act fast. There's no time for dithering around. It would be really lovely to hear kind of from your perspective, from where you are now. What are you learning? What are you learning about, these crises, and how do you maneuver in them? What are you learning about these mechanisms that you have to work with, and what's been successful and not successful?
I think that's a great question, and it's a question that we should all ask ourselves, regardless of age or generation. I am learning that there's a reason that there are some people who have a guaranteed seat at the table, and it's because they have shaped the infrastructure that we're continuing to build upon. There's a reason why they are looked to as the arbiters of certain decisions. And at the same time, there's a reason why we always advocate for youth participation. We do it imperfectly, bringing in youth voices, and it's so important because the fresh ideas, the spark of change can come from many places. It doesn't have to happen on a generational basis. But I feel that there are times when I speak up, when other people appreciate it, because I'm bolder and maybe more direct in voicing concerns that other people may feel they have to tiptoe around. I also think I'm learning a lot about the ways in which we're hamstringed in this process because of the bureaucracy, because of the fact that there are so many stakeholders involved in the process. It's a beautiful thing. It's a tapestry of so many voices and so many interest groups. And at the same time, when you're working in it, you appreciate how incredibly difficult it is. I mean, my heart goes out to the team at UN Women that's trying to steward us through this process, because it is so challenging. And at the same time, I feel like I'm banging my fists against the door and saying, well, why does it have to be this way? That question of why do we have to accept it with all the formality and the pomp and circumstance of what has come before? Why can't we just kind of burn the house down and do it differently? So I have that impulse. I also have a lot of respect for what has been built before. And, you mentioned that Beijing was the culmination of so much. The UN Decade on Women was 1976 to 1985, and then the Nairobi conference happened. So it's not like Beijing was the watershed moment before any other watershed moment. There were so many that preceded it, and there will be so many to come after the Generation Equality Forum. But I think, for me, what's really important is, how can I enter the space with creativity and curiosity and empathy and determination and a desire to really, really listen from other people, because the concerns they're raising are really valid, even if some of them feel like minutia. And I think it's just an opportunity to learn how to shine in a way that doesn't take away from the very valuable contributions of other people. And that's something that you learn throughout your life. But I think the more you're in these spaces, intergenerational, international, multilingual, complex processes, the more it, feels really immediate.
I think you're touching on something that's really important, which is the mechanisms that we have in front of us, the ways that we work together to try to make our visions real. And I think that's really important because if you look back and say, okay, now the Beijing Platform of Action was a brilliant document, but where are we now, right? How well have we done in terms of that Beijing Platform of Action? And one of the real the sadness out of that is that our visions have faltered on the sort of the rocks of implementation. The institutions that we had faith in to actually implement these visions, have not really delivered in the way we expected them to deliver. And I think here feminists have really given us insights and understanding of, how do power dynamics work in these kinds of places, right? And what gets prioritized, what doesn't get prioritized, and why. And so not only do we have that understanding now, but we also have new visions. I mean, when we think of the crises we're facing, if you look at where are some of the really brilliant new visions for our future, they're coming from feminists. Kate Raworth and other feminist economists are kind of leading us to a new way of thinking about economy, which is not built on growth, but it's built on care and well-being. That's a fundamentally different vision, and that is coming from feminists. If you look at, feminist movements all over the world, they're really building new kinds of solidarities, and those solidarities and the work that they're doing to build new movements for advocacy and change are critical. Like, in 2013, there was that research done, you remember, by Thun and Weldon, which looked at what is the main sort of significant factor in legislative change on violence against women. And it turned out to be autonomous feminist organizing, right? And that was research that looked over the data over 70 countries. So that, there's been this groundswell of movement work to change. And that's been really, really important. And I think we are now at a stage, I'm certainly at a stage where I feel, these institutions just don't work for us anymore. And there's that not Mala Tun, but Mona El Tahawi. She's a American Egyptian journalist who talks about patriarchy as an octopus, and where the head of the octopus is patriarchy, and all of the limbs are, racism and capitalism and ableism and, all these other isms that we're fighting against. And we as feminists have been chipping away at all of these limbs, but the head has remained intact and those limbs regenerate. And, I think it's now time to just chop off that head, chop off the head of patriarchy and say, let's burn this house down and let's figure out how to build anew so that we can, move forward. Seems, it's a smash strategy. It's not a, let's come together and build strategy, but some things, really do have to go.
But I think what's sometimes frustrating is that sometimes smashing patriarchy feels passé in the eyes of people of my generation and the generation that is coming up behind us, Generation Z, where for them, attacking the climate crisis is paramount. And not all of them are thinking about it through a racial and a gendered lens. some people are thinking about it very holistically and others aren't. And they look at the issue of gender, and for them, it's not so much a space of conflict as a space of creative expression of their gender identity and expression across a whole spectrum. And it's a source of joy, and it's a place of coming together. And so their experiences are different. And I think, you had mentioned the change strategies that work and don't work. You've also spent decades on this as an organizational change strategist, as someone who has pioneered different feminist, inclusive approaches to culture change, which is something we work on at Breakthrough as well. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what has worked in terms of feminist change strategies and what has not been working in the decades since Beijing?
One of the key strategies that emerged out of the Beijing conference was this idea that, that organizations should adopt gender mainstreaming as a way to embed focus on gender within all of the work that they do, as a way to achieve gender equality. And that really has hit a brick wall in many of these organizations. It kind of died a slow death, in the black holes of organizations, and lived somewhere in the basement behind the boiler. Or just got hit in the face by other kinds of values and systems that really are at the foundation of these organizations. And when you say that younger feminists now don't really have a focus on gender or patriarchy as a sort of a means of, as a primary form of oppression, or a primary language and vision that shapes, their world, and they see gender more as an expression of joy, and that's really true. The ways in which we understand gender now have really expanded, and there's a joy and a celebration in that diversity, and at the same time, regardless of the issue you're dealing with, whether it's peace and security, or it's economy, or it's jobs, or it's addressing poverty, or it's addressing maternal health. In each of these systems, you find patriarchal values embedded, and they have, made certain choices that have excluded a lot of people of color, women in many parts of the world, and have excluded based on caste and class and all of these other issues. So it's still, I think, a very relevant issue, and we need to understand its relevance in shaping the issues, because the new visions that we have are really changing that foundation. So a sort of a rapacious capitalist growth-oriented path, is very different from a path of growth which is centered on caring for people and caring for the environment, right? And so that's a switch in values. So I just wanted to say that, because I think it does continue to be relevant. I think also, when you talk about strategies that worked and didn't work, one of the things that we haven't really had success in putting in place in a lot of institutions has to deal with accountability. So yeah, okay, great. We've all agreed on the commitments. We're all going to take them forward in all the ways we want to take them forward. We're putting them into our policies. We're going to act, have programs that are going to try to make this happen and make it a reality. A lot of that is on paper, and, but it's not that they aren't the cadres of people like you, right? Or like me, that work in institutions or with institutions all over the world. There are so many more people who work on gender issues within all of these kinds of organizations that didn't exist 26 years ago, right? But, you know, let's take the issue of sexual harassment, right? This is an old issue and it's a new issue. So where is the accountability for, you know, transparency and for justice when it comes to sexual harassment and abuse? You know, it took a real crisis for this to kind of blow up in the international NGO arena, right? With Oxfam and with the other organizations. And then all these organizations, you know, kind of clamored and scrambled and developed these policies, which they call safeguarding, which is a term I don't like, you know. They should just call it what it is, right? It's about sexual harassment, abuse, and exploitation. And it's about addressing that. But, you know, a lot of these international organizations, who are they accountable to? Not really anybody, right? We don't have an international court like they have in The Hague for the UN or for, you know, international NGOs. Governments, okay, there is some kind of a vague accountability system in the sense that democracies, you know, have a way of allowing people to say, you know, what they think. But a lot of these organizations aren't accountable to anybody, really, you know, when you think about it. And that's an issue which haunts us, you know. It's not an easy issue to put into place because who wants to hold themselves accountable, you know? Power doesn't want to hold itself accountable to you. So that's always been a big issue. But I would say that, you know, where you have gender equality goals sort of firmly embedded in a larger ecology of justice and social justice and equity, and are at the center of an organization's focus, strategic focus, then, you know, it gives them a better chance to work. You know, if they're kind of outside over here, you know, here's what we really care about, and then there's this gender equality thing, you know, that's kind of over here, then that doesn't usually work. And that happens with a lot of organizations, you know. Who are the ones who are the gender focal points? Well, let's get Priya because she's a girl, you know, that kind of stuff. So there's 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
There is a challenge that we've been facing for decades of the continued sidelining of advocates for gender equality and continued under-resourcing. But I think I just want to go back to a point I made earlier about gender as creative expression and as a site of joy and, you know, personal meaning making. I think it absolutely is. And we've explored that and been in awe of people who have just burst open the doors of the gender binary. But there's also, I think, increasingly a recognition of gendered harms. And when I say that people aren't quite as excited about gender and patriarchy, you know, as big words and big concepts, I think it's because there's been a pivot to focus on very, very specific intersectional issues. So there are people who are advocates for ending, you know, the murders of Black trans women in the South and other parts of the United States. And there are people who are ecofeminists who are particularly attuned to water protection and how we preserve Indigenous heritage and the heritage that a lot of women carry forward, as well as our natural resources. So there's a lot of nuance, I think, that's coming up. People really buy into this idea that we are people who live complex lives and are touched by myriad issues. And so it's not, gender isn't enough. It has to be gender plus plus. It has to be gender plus environment plus racial justice plus economic justice plus prison abolition. And then you have a winning formula for something that really has mass appeal. And so it's kind of paradoxical because then you have these global movement spaces like Generation Equality, which are adopting a more traditional approach to gender and to feminism that maybe feels outmoded to some feminists of my generation. I want to close with a question, which is that as you think about me coming up in this space, is there anything that you hope for me or from me as I move forward?
Yes, I hope that, that the vision that you just described, which is multifaceted, which brings together not only issues, and because they're all related, like the environment, like land, water, access, like health, like reproductive rights, like safety, like the economy and jobs. A vision that brings that holistically together. I hope for you and your generation that you're able to connect those visions, and you're able to connect across the fault lines that divide us, the fault lines of race and class and religion and gender. And that is one of the hardest things to do. And it's not like it hasn't been tried before, there have been coalitions of all kinds of organizations and people with all kinds of particular entry into, looking at the world, who have tried to come together. And those coalitions, as you know, because you've worked in coalitions, are difficult to bring together, and they're difficult to sustain over a period of time. You can sustain them when there's a very clear, concrete objective in mind. And once that objective is met, then those coalitions don't tend to come together. But my hope is that for you, that you're able to be part of this kind of a coalition and sustain it, knowing that you have to work quickly, and you have to work in a way that helps you thrive as an individual, that helps your community thrive, and then helps the planet thrive. And my hope for you as a young leader is that you find meaning and joy in that.
Well, thank you. That's a beautiful wish and hope, and I take it to heart. Of course, we've had many conversations about feminism and human rights and the opportunities and challenges and the ways that we make meaning and we find joy and sustain it in our world of our family. So it's kind of fun to bring this conversation out to the public in this way. I want to say thank you so much for taking time.
I want to hear your advice to my generation. So what would you like to say? I want you to have the last word. So what would you as a young leader say to activists of my generation?
Honestly, I don't know that I could say anything different from what activists who were younger looking up to their elders have said in the past, except hold space for us. Don't discount what we have to say. Don't discount what we feel, what our priorities are, and trust that we look up to you and we learn from you, and that we're interested in working together in exciting and creative ways, and that our vehicles for doing that might just be a little different. And if you are willing to adapt with us, then we can create something beautiful together. I don't know that that's a message that is any different from what you might have said, to somebody whom you looked up to, but I think it's a message that is perennial for a reason. Acknowledging how much of a privilege it is to be in community with feminists across generations, and at the same time, how much we have to bring, and how excited we are to be able to participate, and hopeful we are that you'll give us a chance.
Absolutely. It's been wonderful talking with you, Priya.
Always.
Always. Love you.
Love you too.